Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series on foods from TV and film with some inspiration from this now famous scene from Spider-Man Homecoming.
What's the matter? Thought you loved larb. It's too larby? Not larby enough. How many times do I have to say larb before you talk to me?
Okay, so for those who are not familiar, larb gai, or just larb as it is often colloquially referred to, is a Thai small plate dish composed of ground minced meat and aromatic veggies that are sauteed and wrapped in a fresh butter lettuce leaf. There are many variations on this classic Thai dish that can include all kinds of veggies and aromatics like Thai chilies, Thai basil, green onions, and more. Personally, as far as I can tell though, by far the key to a more larb-y, larb gai in the words of Aunt May, come from the use of dry toasted rice powder, which we're going to be using to season our ground minced meat. This is also where a number of our key Thai ingredients are going to come into play as well, including glutinous rice, lemongrass, and my two personal favorites, a bit of galangal root and kefir lime leaves, both of which you will find come up in a lot of Thai cuisine for their aromatic flavor. Okay, so let's get into it.
Everybody wants to be the baby. And you're dying if you think that you don't know. Never mind, that you still don't know.
Okay, kicking things off, I'm starting with my familiar stuff first. This is a couple of green onions, which I'm separating by their whites and greens, slicing thinly, and then reserving the greens done on a bias for our finishing garnish. Then next up is half of a red onion, which I'm slicing into strips and setting aside for our wok fry later on. Then diving into our Thai flavors next. These are my Thai chilies, which I'm removing their stems and then similarly slicing thinly. These are going to be responsible for pretty much all of the heat in our dish today, so dial this bit up or down depending on your preference. I'm using 8, which was fairly spicy, so adjust accordingly. Then next up is my lemongrass. Now this stuff has a pretty tough and chewy exterior, so I'm starting by peeling off its exterior layer to reveal a softer and more tender center underneath. Then I'm splitting this open and slicing this up. We're going to be blitzing this in our food processor later on, so no need to be particularly careful about our chop here. Next up is my galangal root. Now I've read many folks try and substitute this stuff with plain old ginger root, I'm guessing because it looks somewhat similar, but I gotta say that this stuff is dramatically different in its smell and taste from the ginger root that you will have seen in many of these videos by now, so if you can, I highly recommend seeking this stuff out in particular. I know this might be tricky for some folks, and I personally have postponed this dish for several months because I haven't been able to locate galangal root, but it is fairly stable in the fridge and comes up in a lot of Thai cuisine, so if you do get your hands on some, buy a little bit extra for your pantry. I'm slicing off about an inch's worth here, only to discover there's a super thick stem inside of my galangal root that my knife doesn't seem to want to cut through. Did I mention this stuff is crazy? Excuse me while I look up what to do about this. Okay, so I'm just gonna chop around that and pop you right back in there, I guess. I don't know. Moving on to my kefir lime leaves next. Again, just like our galangal root, I have also read some folks try and substitute this stuff with a dry bay leaf or two. But again, as much as I am a proponent of substitutions, I gotta say that this is a very specific flavor to Thai cuisine. So if you can get your hands on this, it's gonna make a really big difference. I'm dicing this stuff up as well and then setting this all aside while we take a look at our ground meat next. Okay, so for our version today, I'm going with a little bit of ground pork here, about a pound's worth. I know that ground chicken is also super traditional to use in a larb too, but use whatever you have available though. Whatever you do use, most importantly is that we want to make sure we're working with a fairly fatty mincemeat. At least 20% fat or so is my preference. We're not doing too much with our marinade today since the bulk of our seasoning is going to come from our toasted rice powder. So this is just half a teaspoon of cornstarch to keep things from overcooking in the wok fry, plus half a teaspoon of white pepper, and then I'm setting this aside while we dive into our sauce next. Kicking things off, as with a lot of Thai food, I'm starting with 2 tablespoons of fish sauce plus the juice of about half of a lime for a bit of acidity and brightness. Then next, I'm adding a tablespoon of brown sugar plus a pinch of kosher salt here until dissolved. Remember that fish sauce is already quite sweet, so go easy on the sugar here. Finally, last up, I'm measuring out 3/4 cup of glutinous rice, or if you don't have any, plain old long grain or jasmine rice will work fine too. And then we're heading over to the stove to toast this up. Over on the stove, I've got a very dry, unoiled wok heating up, and then I'm adding my rice and letting this toast dry until nice and browned. This took me about 10 minutes, so be patient here because this is where all of our aromatic flavor is gonna come from. Then I'm adding my galangal root, kefir lime leaves, and lemongrass, and giving all of this a toss for about 2 minutes until fragrant. Finally, I'm removing this from heat and very ambitiously starting things off with my mortar and pestle, only to discover that this is gonna take forever. So I gave up and tossed this into a food processor and blitzed it for about 2 minutes with 3-second pulses until a loose, grainy powder forms. Then I'm adding this back to my mortar and pestle and giving it one more final crush before heading back over to the stove to start cooking. Finally, over on the stove, I've got my wok heated up as hot as possible, and then I'm adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil, and as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then first up are my red onions, which I'm tossing for about a minute. You will notice that I am reserving about half of these in their raw form for later on, more on this in a bit. Then I'm pushing all of this to one side of our wok and clearing some space for our aromatics next. Here is the whites of my green onions, followed by my Thai chili. We're blooming these in our hot oil for about 15 seconds until fragrant before tossing to combine. Finally, my ground mince is heading into the wok, which I'm tossing until cooked through, and then very gradually adding my fish sauce mixture plus my toasted rice powder blend. Once this is combined, I'm removing from heat, adding the remainder of my raw red onion to the mixing bowl, and tossing this all to combine. Then last up, I'm breaking off a few of the biggest pieces of butter lettuce that I can find, adding 2 tablespoons of beet to each leaf, finishing with the greens of my green onions and a bit of fresh lime, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so I'll admit that this dish was an unexpectedly challenging one for me to make, at least, not only because I found myself working with a handful of ingredients that I have not used before, but also because the method of seasoning is very different from your typical wok fry. The Larb Gai, as you might have noticed, does not contain a sauce element as you would often find when doing wok fries, but rather all of its flavor comes from dry aromatic seasoning as opposed to the heavy umami sauces that you'll find in Chinese food or even some of the more common Thai noodle dishes like pad Thai or pad ki mao. The result is a really fragrant and aromatic dish that's a little bit more subtle in flavor, which makes it great as a small plate. Our ground pork is super juicy from its fat content. The Thai chili has a nice bit of heat, and of course our dry toasted rice powder gives a wonderfully floral array to all of it. Finally, the addition of our reserved raw onion adds a nice bit of brightness and crunch to the whole dish that pairs really well with the fresh butter lettuce. I know sourcing a few of these ingredients is going to be tricky for some folks, but if you can manage it, I hope you give this one a try. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. This was a fun, challenging one for me to take a shot at because it definitely took me way outside of my comfort zone. We'll also be cooking through this one live this coming Monday at 6:30 PST right here on YouTube. So if you want, tune in then and cook along with me too. For those who are local to the Bay Area, the Woo Can Cook Fried Rice pop-up is back at the Alameda Antiques Fair this coming Sunday. So if you're in the area, come by and say hi. More on that at woocancook.com/eats. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Do you want to be, baby? Yes. Do you want to be, baby? Oh, wait, not me. I said everybody.